The wind, a relentless sculptor of the high plains, clawed at Elara Hayes, whipping strands of pale hair across her face, stinging her eyes with dust motes fine as milled flour. It was a sound she'd known all her life, this mournful song of the prairie, but today it carried a new, sharper edge, mirroring the raw desolation that had hollowed her from within. The dust, thick and cloying, settled on the black bombazine of her morning dress, a grim second skin she'd worn for 3 weeks, since the day the fever took her father, Sheriff Theron Hayes, leaving her adrift in a world suddenly vast and menacing. Before her, the town of Redemption, a handful of weathered buildings huddled against the immense, indifferent sky, seemed to shrink under the oppressive weight of the late autumn sun. Each windowpane glinted like a watchful eye, and Elara felt their collective gaze, speculative and tinged with a pity that felt more like judgment. She was the sheriff's daughter, yes, but now she was the late sheriff's daughter, a subtle but devastating shift in an unforgiving landscape where a woman alone was a vulnerability, an anomaly. Her father's house, small and stark at the edge of town, felt less like a home and more like a cage whose bars were forged from memory and grief. The air inside was thick with his absence, the scent of his pipe tobacco long faded, the comforting creak of his boots on the floorboard silenced. All that remained were his meager possessions and the crushing weight of his debts, a legacy of quiet generosity that had left his only child facing a stark, terrifying future. The town council, embodied by the portly, self-important Mayor Thompson, had been swift in their pronouncements, their condolences laced with an unspoken urgency. A young woman alone, it's not proper, Elara, not safe, he'd said, his gaze skittering away from hers, settling on the threadbare rug. You'll need to make arrangements. The house, well, it belongs to the town, you understand. For the next sheriff. The words, though couched in feigned concern, had been a thinly veiled eviction notice. Arrangements. What arrangements could she possibly make? She had no kin to speak of, no dowry save for a quiet nature and a skill with mending that would hardly keep body and soul together. The wind howled again, a keening cry that seemed to pull the very breath from her lungs. Despair, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. She clutched the worn wooden porch rail, her knuckles white, the rough grain a small, painful anchor in the maelstrom of her fear. Redemption. It had always seemed a hopeful name for a town carved out of such harshness. Now, it felt like a cruel irony. There would be no redemption for her here, only a slow slide into a destitution she could barely comprehend. The biting wind carried the scent of wood smoke and distant cattle, the sounds of a smithy's hammer, the rumble of a wagon, the ordinary life of the town moving on, oblivious or indifferent to the chasm that had opened beneath her feet. She was an island, her grief a moat no one dared to cross. Silas Blackwood observed her from the shadowed doorway of the mercantile, his presence as unobtrusive and constant as the mountains that fringed the horizon. He'd seen the change in Elara Hayes, the way the already quiet girl had seemed to shrink further into herself, her shoulders bowed as if under an invisible burden. He knew about burdens. His own ranch, miles out from Redemption, was a testament to them, a sprawling, often unforgiving piece of land he'd carved out with calloused hands and relentless will. He was a man of few words, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, missing nothing. He'd known Sheriff Hayes, respected him as one of the few truly honest men in a territory often governed by greed and expedience. The sheriff's quiet integrity had been a rare commodity, and Silas had sensed a similar quality in his daughter, a gentle stillness that stood in stark contrast to the boisterous, often cruel, nature of frontier life. He'd seen the mayor leaving her house earlier, his self-satisfied air a clear indication that no comfort had been offered, only ultimatums. Silas understood the town's unspoken rules, the swift, brutal calculus of survival. Elara Hayes was an inconvenience, a loose thread in their tightly woven, self-serving fabric. He bought his supplies, flour, coffee, cartridges, his movements economical, his voice low when he spoke to the storekeeper. But his thoughts remained on the small figure on the porch of the sheriff's house, a solitary silhouette against the fading light. He was not a man given to impulsive acts, his decisions weighed and measured like grain. Yet, as he loaded his wagon, the image of her desolate stance, the vulnerability in the set of her shoulders, lodged itself in his mind, a burr that pricked at a conscience he rarely acknowledged. The town would offer her charity, perhaps, a position as a drudge in someone's kitchen, her spirit slowly eroded by endless toil and the pitying glances of her benefactors. Or worse. He'd seen what became of women left alone and unprotected in these parts. The thought settled in his gut, cold and hard. He was not a savior, nor did he wish to be. But there was a stark, pragmatic clarity to the solution that began to form in his mind, a solution born not of sentiment, but of a strange, unbidden sense of responsibility, and perhaps, a flicker of something akin to respect for the legacy her father had left, a legacy now embodied in her fragile existence. He finished his business, his expression unreadable, and turned his wagon towards the edge of town, not towards his ranch, but towards the small, weathered house where the sheriff's daughter stood alone against the encroaching dusk. The wind seemed to whisper a warning, or perhaps an inevitability. Elara heard the slow creak of wagon wheels, the soft thud of boots on her porch steps, and her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against its cage. She turned, expecting Mayor Thompson, perhaps, or one of the sanctimonious church ladies with their platitudes and probing questions. Instead, Silas Blackwood stood there, a tall, rangy figure silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. His presence filled the small porch, an aura of quiet intensity about him that was both intimidating and oddly reassuring. She knew him only by sight, a solitary man who kept to himself, his ranch a distant rumor of hard work and self-sufficiency. He was not unkind, people said, but not given to social niceties either. He simply was like the granite outcrops in the hills, unyielding and enduring. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that seemed almost incongruous with his rugged appearance. His dark hair was streaked with an unexpected touch of silver at the temples, his face lean, carved by the elements, his eyes holding hers with a directness that made her want to look away, yet compelled her to meet his gaze. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was not unkind, but it held no artifice, no false sympathy. Elara nodded, her throat too tight for words. The silence stretched, filled only by the sighing wind and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She waited, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. What could this formidable man want with her? Had he come to offer his condolences? It seemed unlikely, so long after the fact. "I knew your father," he stated, not elaborated. "He was a good man." Again, a simple statement, devoid of flourish, yet it carried a weight of sincerity that touched her more deeply than all the mayor's flowery speeches. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. He shifted his weight, his gaze sweeping briefly over the small, neat yard, the carefully tended, though now wilting, patch of herbs her father had loved. "I understand your situation is difficult." His eyes returned to hers, steady, unwavering. Elara felt a flush creep up her neck. The whole town knew. Of course, they did. She was their latest topic of gossip, their cautionary tale. "The town offers little for a woman alone," he continued, his tone practical, almost detached. "Little that's fitting." There was a stark truth in his words that stripped away any pretense. She could not argue. He paused, and for a moment, she thought he might turn and leave, his duty, whatever it was, done. But then he spoke again, his words dropping into the stillness like stones into a deep well. "I have a proposal, Miss Hayes. A practical one." Her breath hitched. A proposal? From Silas Blackwood? The idea was so outlandish, so unexpected, it left her momentarily speechless. She could only stare at him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it. "My ranch needs a woman's hand," he said, his gaze unflinching. "And you need a home. Protection. A name." He did not say the word marriage, but it hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. "This ain't a proposal of the heart, Miss Hayes. I wouldn't insult you by pretending it is, not now." His honesty was brutal, yet in a strange way, it was also a relief. There was no sentimentality, no pretense of affection she would be obliged to reciprocate. It was a transaction, stark and simple. It's a business arrangement, if you will. Respect. Provision. Safety. That I can offer. He looked out at the darkening plains, then back at her. Think on it. No need for an answer now. But time is not on your side. With another dip of his head, he turned and descended the steps, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. He climbed onto his wagon and, with a quiet word to his horses, was gone, swallowed by the deepening shadows. Elara stood rooted to the spot, the wind suddenly feeling colder, more invasive. A proposal. From Silas Blackwood. The audacity of it, the sheer unexpectedness, left her reeling. A marriage of convenience. A way out of her predicament. But at what cost? To tie herself to this stranger, this silent, watchful man? Fear warred with a desperate, nascent flicker of hope. The alternative was bleak, a slow descent into a life she could not bear to imagine. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and for the first time in weeks, a sliver of something other than despair began to pierce the darkness. The days that followed were a torment of indecision. Elara replayed Silas Blackwood's words, his blunt, unadorned proposal, over and over in her mind. Each dawn brought a fresh wave of anxiety, the shrinking window of her independence closing in. Mayor Thompson had sent word, a polite but firm reminder that the sheriff's house needed to be vacated by the end of the month. The townswomen, those who bothered to acknowledge her, offered pitying glances and hushed whispers that followed her like shadows whenever she ventured out for necessities. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose kindness was often buried beneath a brusque exterior, had pressed a small sack of hoarded sugar into Elara's hand. "Theron was good to us," she'd murmured, her eyes kind. "You think carefully, child. Some choices are harder than others, but a body's got to survive." It was the closest anyone had come to offering genuine advice. Elara spent hours staring out at the vast, indifferent landscape, the very landscape Silas Blackwood had offered her a share in, albeit a share defined by duty rather than affection. She knew little of him, only the surface details: a prosperous rancher, a man who kept his own counsel, respected for his honesty but not sought out for his company. He was an enigma, his stoicism a wall she couldn't imagine breaching. Yet, his offer, stark as it was, represented a lifeline. It was a choice between two unknowns: the slow, public erosion of her dignity in redemption, or a life with a stranger in the isolation of the plains. She remembered her father's quiet respect for Blackwood. A man of his word, Theron had said once, after Blackwood had helped track a rustler. Doesn't say much, but when he does, it's solid as bedrock. Bedrock! That was what Elara craved, something solid to stand on in the shifting sands of her life. The alternative was to become a drudge, dependent on the fickle charity of others, her spirit slowly withering. The thought of surrendering her autonomy, what little she had left, to the whims of the town council or a series of grudging employers, was a suffocating prospect. Silas Blackwood offered a different kind of servitude, perhaps, but it came with the promise of a roof, of provision, of a name that would shield her from the worst of the world's judgments. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and sorrow, Elara made her decision. It was not a choice made with joy, or even with hope, but with a grim, pragmatic resolve. She would trade one form of desolation for another, hoping that the latter offered at least a measure of security. The next morning, she walked to the mercantile, her steps unnaturally firm, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She asked Mrs. Henderson to send word to Silas Blackwood. Tell him I accept his proposal." The words felt foreign on her tongue, a commitment to a future she could not envision. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with a mixture of relief and concern. She simply nodded, her eyes conveying an understanding that needed no words. Elara felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were watching herself from a great distance, a small, solitary figure making a desperate bargain with fate. The die was cast. She would become Mrs. Silas Blackwood, mistress of a ranch she had never seen, wife to a man she barely knew. The wind, as always, whispered its secrets, but now, amidst its mournful sighs, she thought she detected a new note, one of faint, almost imperceptible, possibility. Or perhaps it was just the echo of her own desperate hope. The wedding was a stark, hurried affair, conducted in the small, dusty office of the circuit judge, a man whose bored expression suggested he'd seen too many unions forged from necessity rather than affection. Ilara wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple gown of ivory lawn, yellowed with age, hastily altered to fit her slender frame. It felt like a costume, the fabric whispering of a love and hope she couldn't dare to claim for herself. Silas stood beside her, solid and impassive in a clean but well-worn suit, his usual denim exchanged for dark broadcloth. He smelled faintly of soap and leather, a clean, earthy scent that was surprisingly grounding. The only witnesses were Mrs. Henderson, her round face etched with a mixture of sympathy and approval, and Jedediah Stone, Silas's taciturn foreman, a man whose weathered face looked as if it had been carved from old oak. The judge mumbled through the vows, his voice a monotonous drone. When it was Ilara's turn to speak, her voice was a mere thread of sound, the words "I do" catching in her throat, feeling like a betrayal of some unspoken dream she'd once cherished. Silas's responses were equally quiet, but firm, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the judge's shoulder. There were no rings exchanged. Silas had deemed them an unnecessary frippery for such a practical arrangement. Afterwards, in the stark silence that followed the pronouncement, Mrs. Henderson pressed Ilara's hand. "Be good to him, child," she whispered, her eyes earnest. "He's a good man, beneath that quiet." Ilara could only nod, her throat aching with unshed tears. Then came the journey to Blackwood Ranch. It was a long, jolting ride in Silas's sturdy wagon, the miles stretching out across an endless expanse of grassland, punctuated by rocky outcrops and groves of hardy cottonwoods clinging to the banks of dry creek beds. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the horses' harnesses. Ilara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. She was acutely aware of Silas beside her, the occasional brush of his arm against hers sending a strange tremor through her. He drove the team with a quiet competence, his movements economical and precise. He offered no conversation, and she, lost in a maelstrom of apprehension and uncertainty, could find no words. What did one say to a man who was now her husband, yet remained a virtual stranger? The landscape was beautiful in its own harsh, uncompromising way, but it felt alien, vast, and intimidating. This was to be her home now, this sprawling, untamed wilderness. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows, they crested a small rise. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley, lay Blackwood Ranch. It was larger than she had imagined, a collection of sturdy, well-maintained buildings, a long, low ranch house built of timber and stone, a substantial barn, corrals, and various outbuildings. Smoke curled from the chimney of the house, a thin, welcoming plume against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It looked solid, enduring. Like the man beside her? As they drew closer, a dog barked, a deep, resonant sound, and then a figure emerged from the barn, Jedediah Stone, who had ridden ahead. He nodded to Silas, his gaze briefly flicking to Ilara, unreadable. Silas reined in the horses before the house. "We're home," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of inflection. Home. The word echoed strangely in Ilara's mind. He climbed down and then, to her surprise, turned and offered her his hand. His grip was strong, calloused, but surprisingly gentle as he helped her down from the wagon. For a moment, her fingers lingered in his, and she felt an unexpected flicker of something. Not warmth, precisely, but a sense of solidity, of being anchored. The house, when they entered, was simple but clean, the main room dominated by a large stone fireplace. It was sparsely furnished, clearly a man's domain, but there was an orderliness to it, a sense of quiet purpose. Jedediah had already lit a lamp, its golden glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. "Supper's laid out, boss," Jedediah said, gesturing to a small table set for two. "Mrs. Stone sent over some stew." Silas nodded. "Thank her for me." Jedediah grunted an affirmative and then, with another brief, inscrutable glance at Ilara, retreated, presumably to the bunkhouse. The silence descended again, thicker now within the confines of the house. Ilara stood awkwardly by the door, her small valise at her feet. Silas gestured towards the table. "Eat," he said. It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of necessity. The stew was hot and savory, and Elara realized she was famished. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against pottery. She risked a glance at him across the table. His face, in the lamplight, was all angles and shadows, his expression unreadable. What was he thinking? Did he regret this impulsive, practical marriage already? Was she a disappointment, too quiet, too timid? After the meal, he rose. "I'll show you your room." He led her down a short hallway to a small, plainly furnished room at the back of the house. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small chest of drawers. It was stark, but clean. "This will be yours," he said. "The main bedroom is mine." His gaze met hers, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of something in their depths, uncertainty, perhaps. Or was it just a reflection of her own unease? "I expect nothing from you, Elara, beyond what we agreed. A hand in running the house. Respect. Nothing more." His words were clear, unequivocal. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made her dizzy, washed over her. She had feared. She didn't know what she had feared, but his straightforwardness, his clear delineation of boundaries, was a balm. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heartfelt. He nodded, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Get some rest. The days start early here." He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Elara sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs trembling. She was Mrs. Silas Blackwood. Wife to a stranger. Mistress of a house that did not feel like home. Yet, in the quiet starkness of this room, in the echo of her husband's carefully chosen words, she felt a tiny, fragile seed of something that might, one day, grow into a semblance of peace. The wind outside had dropped to a murmur, a soft sigh against the window pane. For the first time in a long time, Elara felt the crushing weight on her chest ease, just a fraction. Life on Blackwood Ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the relentless demands of the land. Elara, true to her word, took over the running of the household. The tasks were familiar in nature, cooking, cleaning, mending, but the scale was different. Feeding Silas and occasionally Jedediah Stone, keeping the surprisingly spacious ranch house in order, tending a small kitchen garden she established near the back door, these things filled her days. Silas was a constant, quiet presence. He rose before dawn and was out on the range until dusk, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. He spoke little, his communication often limited to brief instructions or observations about the weather or the cattle. Yet, Elara began to observe him, to learn the nuances of his silences, the subtle shifts in his expression. She saw the way his jaw tightened when a storm threatened the newly calved herd, the rare, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when he spoke of his prize bull, or when her bread turned out particularly well. He was a man of deep, ingrained habits, his life ordered and precise. He ate what she cooked without comment, though she noticed he favored her stews and freshly baked bread. He never entered her room, and she never ventured into his, the unspoken boundary between them as solid as the stone walls of the house. Yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a pattern of coexistence emerged. She learned to anticipate his needs, a hot meal ready when he returned, weary and dust-covered, from the range, his mending done before he had to ask. In turn, he ensured she had everything she needed, ample supplies from town, wood chopped and stacked for the stove, repairs made to the house before she even noticed they were necessary. There were no tender words, no shared laughter, no gentle touches. Their marriage was a framework of practicality, devoid of the emotional intimacy she had once, in some secret corner of her heart, dreamed of. Yet, there was a peculiar comfort in the predictability, in the unspoken understanding that grew between them. She was no longer the vulnerable, pitted sheriff's daughter. Here, she was Mrs. Blackwood, a woman with a role, a purpose. The vastness of the plains, initially so intimidating, began to feel less alien. She found a quiet solace in the sweeping vistas, the dramatic sunsets, the resilient beauty of the wildflowers that bloomed in the spring. One afternoon, a sudden, violent hailstorm swept across the valley, the ice stones as large as pigeon eggs, battering the roof and threatening her newly planted garden. Ilara rushed outside, a frantic desire to protect her fragile seedlings overtaking her usual caution. She was struggling with a heavy piece of canvas, the wind tearing at it, when Silas appeared, seemingly from nowhere. Without a word, he took the canvas from her, his powerful hands easily maneuvering it into place, securing it against the onslaught. They worked together in the driving hail, a silent, efficient team, until the small garden was protected. When it was done, they stood for a moment under the narrow overhang of the porch, drenched and shivering, the roar of the hail a deafening cacophony around them. He looked at her then, his expression unreadable in the storm-dimmed light, but his eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't name, approval, perhaps, or a grudging respect. "You're a fool to risk yourself for a few plants," he said, his voice gruff, but without true anger. "They're important," she replied, her teeth chattering. "They're a piece of home." He didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned and went inside. Later, after the storm had passed, leaving a trail of battered foliage and glistening ice, she found a small, skillfully woven willow cloche placed carefully over her most delicate tomato plant. Silas never mentioned it. He didn't need to. The gesture spoke volumes, a quiet act of consideration that resonated more deeply than any spoken sentiment. Slowly, Ilara began to feel a sense of belonging, not just to the ranch, but to this silent, watchful man who was her husband. The fear that had initially defined her existence here began to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of security. She was still shy, still reserved, but a quiet strength was taking root within her, nurtured by the vastness of the land and the unspoken respect she was slowly earning, and perhaps, beginning to feel. The wedding announcement, when it belatedly reached redemption via a circuitous route of gossip and supply wagons, had caused a stir. Silas Blackwood? Married? The townsfolk had been incredulous. The stern, solitary rancher taking a wife, and of all people, the timid, almost invisible daughter of the late sheriff. Eyebrows were raised, speculation ran rife. Most predicted it wouldn't last, that the quiet girl would be overwhelmed by the harshness of ranch life and the even harsher temperament of its owner. Mayor Thompson had harumphed, declaring it a most unsuitable arrangement, though privately he was relieved to have the matter of Ilara Hayes settled without further burden to the town. Mrs. Henderson, however, had simply smiled, a knowing, satisfied little smile. She had seen something in Silas's uncharacteristic visit to Ilara's porch, something in Ilara's quiet desperation. She hoped for the best, for both of them. Months passed, seasons turned. Autumn deepened into the bitter cold of winter, the plains blanketed in snow, isolating the ranch further. It was during these long, dark months, confined within the warm cocoon of the ranch house, that the unspoken understanding between Ilara and Silas solidified. The silence between them became less a void and more a shared space, comfortable and unforced. Ilara found herself observing the fine lines etched around his eyes, the way his hands, though calloused and strong, could be surprisingly gentle when tending a sick calf or mending a piece of tack. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the rare times a shadow of an old sorrow crossed his face, quickly banished. He, in turn, seemed to notice the small changes in her. He'd once found her humming softly to herself while kneading dough, a small, almost forgotten sound from her girlhood. He hadn't commented, but a faint, almost imperceptible softening had touched his lips. He began to leave her small offerings, a particularly vibrant autumn leaf placed on the kitchen table, a perfectly shaped river stone, a clutch of early spring wildflowers. They were unspoken acknowledgments, small gestures that bridged the silence between them. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them indoors, Ilara sat by the fire, mending one of Silas's shirts. He was at the table, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. "My father," Ilara said softly, her voice startling in the quiet, "he used to say the wind had stories to tell, if you listened close enough." Silas paused in his work, his hand still. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. "He taught me to listen. To the land. To people's silences. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Your father was a good man," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "He understood things most folks don't bother to." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, a small acknowledgement of her past, of the man who had shaped her. Ilara's needle stilled. A warmth spread through her, chasing away some of the lingering chill of her grief. "He would have liked that you look after his land," she said, thinking of the small patch of herbs she tended, an echo of her father's garden. Silas finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the room. There was a depth in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of shared loss. "This land, it asks a lot," he said, his voice rough. "But it gives back, too. If you're patient." Patience. It was something she was learning. Patience with the land, patience with this quiet, complex man, and patience with herself. As winter slowly loosened its grip, giving way to the tentative promise of spring, Ilara felt a change within herself. The shyness was still there, a part of her ingrained nature, but it was no longer crippling. A quiet confidence had begun to bloom, nurtured by the solitude, the responsibility, and the unspoken respect that defined her relationship with Silas. She was no longer just surviving, she was, in her own quiet way, beginning to thrive. The upcoming spring branding would bring more men to the ranch, a temporary disruption to their quiet life. It would also necessitate a trip into Redemption for supplies, their first journey back to the town together since their stark wedding day. The thought filled Ilara with a mixture of apprehension and a new, unfamiliar resolve. She was Mrs. Blackwood now, not the pitiful orphan. She would face them, not with defiance, but with the quiet dignity she had painstakingly cultivated on the windswept plains of her new home. The trip to Redemption was an unspoken test. As their wagon rumbled down the familiar main street, Ilara felt the old, familiar prickle of anxiety, the sensation of being watched, judged. But this time, something was different. Silas sat beside her, a silent, solid presence. He didn't offer words of reassurance, but his nearness was a bulwark against the curious stares and whispered comments. When they stopped at the mercantile, Mayor Thompson bustled out, his face a mask of false bonhomie. "Mr. Blackwood! And Mrs. Blackwood! A pleasure, a distinct pleasure!" His gaze flickered over Ilara, assessing, surprised perhaps by the subtle change in her demeanor. She was no longer hunched and timid, but held herself with a quiet composure. She met his gaze steadily, a small, polite nod her only acknowledgement. Silas conducted his business with his usual quiet efficiency, his presence commanding a respect that brooked no interference. Ilara, instead of waiting meekly in the wagon as she might have done months ago, stood beside him, a silent partner in the transactions. Mrs. Henderson greeted her with genuine warmth. "Child, you look well," she said, her eyes kind, noticing the subtle bloom in Ilara's cheeks, the new confidence in her stance. "Ranch life agrees with you." "It does, Mrs. Henderson," Ilara replied, her voice clear and steady. And she realized, with a jolt of surprise, that it was true. Did agree with her. The harshness, the solitude, the relentless demands, they had forged something new in her, something resilient. While Silas loaded supplies, Ilara found herself face to face with two of the town's more notorious gossips, Mrs. Perryweather and Miss Albright. They cornered her near a bolt of calico, their expressions a mixture of condescension and avid curiosity. "Well, Ilara," Mrs. Perryweather began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we hardly recognized you. So rustic." Ilara felt a flicker of the old panic, the urge to shrink away. But then she thought of the vast, open plains, of the quiet strength of the man who was her husband, of the small, sturdy house that was now her home. She straightened her shoulders. "Mrs. Blackwood," she corrected, her voice quiet but firm. "And yes, life on the ranch is fulfilling." The two women exchanged surprised glances. This was not the timid, downtrodden girl they remembered. Miss Albright, recovering first, pressed on. "But surely, dear, it must be dreadfully lonely? So far from civilization." "And Mr. Blackwood, well, he's not known for his sociability, is he?" Elara met her gaze directly. "My husband is a good man, Miss Albright. And I find I prefer the company of honest silence to other kinds of conversation." Her words, though softly spoken, carried an unexpected sting. Mrs. Perryweather gasped softly. Miss Albright's face flushed. Before they could respond, Silas was there, his shadow falling over them. He said nothing, simply looked from Elara to the two women, his expression unreadable but undeniably formidable. The gossip stammered a hasty farewell and scurried away. Silas turned to Elara. "You handled that well," he said, his voice low. It was high praise, coming from him. A warmth spread through Elara, a sense of quiet triumph. She had faced her old demons and found they held less power over her now. Later, as they prepared to leave Redemption, they passed the small church. A wedding was just letting out, the bride radiant in white lace, the groom beaming beside her. Elara watched them for a moment, a faint wistfulness touching her heart. Her own wedding had been so stark, so devoid of joy. Silas, following her gaze, said nothing, but his hand, resting on the reins, tightened almost imperceptibly. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence felt different, imbued with a new sense of shared experience. As the familiar silhouette of their valley came into view, Elara felt a profound sense of returning home. This stark, demanding land, this quiet, watchful man, they were hers, and she, in some inexplicable way, was theirs. The transformation within her was not complete, perhaps it never would be, but she was no longer the frightened, vulnerable girl who had left Redemption months ago. She was Elara Blackwood, a woman finding her strength in the heart of the wilderness, and in the unexpected sanctuary of a marriage built on practicality, but now, perhaps, beginning to hint at something more. The idea of a proper wedding celebration had never been discussed. Their union was a practical fact, a legal binding, not an occasion for public rejoicing or romantic display. Yet, as the months turned into a year, and then another, a subtle shift occurred in the fabric of their lives. The ranch prospered under Silas's diligent management and Elara's quiet efficiency. The house felt less like a shelter and more like a home, warmed by the scent of her baking, the presence of her carefully tended plants, the order she brought to their shared existence. Jedediah Stone, initially as taciturn as his employer, had gradually thawed, offering Elara gruff compliments on her cooking or a rare, craggy smile when she managed to coax a bloom from a particularly stubborn rosebush she'd planted near the porch. He'd seen the change in Silas, too, a slight easing of the harsh lines around his mouth, a new attentiveness in his eyes when he looked at his wife. One evening, Mrs. Henderson, visiting from Redemption with a bundle of mail and town news, remarked, "You know, Elara, the town still talks about your wedding. Or rather, the lack of one. Some still cluck their tongues." Elara merely smiled. "Let them talk, Mrs. Henderson. We have what matters here." But the seed of an idea had been planted, not by Mrs. Henderson's words, but by an internal stirring Elara herself hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about pleasing the town, or conforming to expectations. It was about acknowledging something. Something that had grown in the silences, in the shared hardships, in the quiet respect that had blossomed between her and Silas. It was Silas who, surprisingly, brought it up. They were sitting on the porch one cool evening, watching the stars emerge in the vast, dark sky. "The preacher's coming through next month," he said, his voice casual, almost too casual. "For the christenings down in the lower valley." Elara waited, sensing there was more. "He could say some words for us. If you'd like." "Properly." Elara turned to him, surprised. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the tension in him, the uncharacteristic vulnerability. "A proper wedding?" she asked softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We never had one." "Not really." Maybe it's time." It wasn't a romantic declaration, not in the conventional sense. But in Silas's world, in their world, it was monumental. It was an admission, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them, a bond that had transcended the practical terms of their original agreement. "Yes, Silas," she said, her voice filled with a quiet emotion that surprised them both. "I think I would like that very much." The preparations were simple. Ilara fashioned a new dress, not from ivory lawn, but from a soft blue calico, the color of the prairie sky on a clear summer morning. She would wear no veil, just a circlet of wildflowers she would gather herself. Silas insisted on inviting a few people, Jedediah and his wife, Mrs. Henderson, and a couple of neighboring ranchers who had shown them kindness. The ceremony was to be held not in a dusty office or a formal church, but under the wide expanse of the sky, in the meadow behind the ranch house, with the mountains as their witness. As the day approached, a nervous anticipation settled over Ilara. This was not the terrified girl accepting a marriage of convenience. This was a woman choosing, consciously and willingly, to reaffirm her commitment to the man who had become her partner, her protector, her quiet anchor in the world. She thought about vows. The perfunctory words spoken before the circuit judge felt hollow, meaningless now. These new vows, vows, needed to be different. They needed to speak the truth of their journey, the truth of what they had built together. The evening before the ceremony, she sat alone in her small room, a piece of paper and a pencil before her, the words struggling to find their way from her heart to the page. What could she say that would encapsulate the quiet miracle of their union? How could she express the gratitude, the respect, the deep, abiding affection that had grown in the fertile soil of their shared life? Her shyness, though diminished, still lingered. To speak such personal words aloud, before even a small gathering, felt daunting. But the desire to honor Silas, to give voice to the unspoken truths between them, was stronger. The morning of their second wedding dawned bright and clear, the sky a flawless arch of blue. A gentle breeze whispered through the tall grasses of the meadow, carrying the scent of wildflowers and warm earth. Ilara, dressed in her simple blue gown, her pale hair adorned with a wreath of columbine and prairie daisies, felt a quiet sense of anticipation, a stark contrast to the dread that had accompanied her first wedding day. Silas stood waiting for her by a makeshift altar of weathered stones, Jedediah beside him. He wore his good suit, the dark broadcloth emphasizing his tall, lean frame. When he saw Ilara approaching, a slow smile, so rare and precious, touched his lips, transforming his usually stern features. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a warmth that made her heart ache with a tender, unfamiliar joy. Mrs. Henderson, her face beaming, stood with a few other women from neighboring ranches, their presence a quiet testament to the acceptance Ilara and Silas had found. The circuit preacher, a kind-faced man with gentle eyes, began the service. His words were simple, heartfelt, speaking of commitment, partnership, and the enduring strength of love found in unexpected places. When it came time for the vows, Silas spoke first. His voice, usually so reserved, was deep and steady, his words carefully chosen, yet filled with an uncharacteristic emotion. He spoke of respect, of gratitude for her steadfastness, her quiet strength, the home she had made for him. He spoke of a partnership forged in hardship, a bond that had become the bedrock of his life. His gaze never left hers, and in their depths, Ilara saw an honesty and a devotion that mirrored her own. Then it was her turn. A hush fell over the small gathering. All eyes were on her, the shy sheriff's daughter, now the rancher's wife. She took a breath, her heart thrumming, the carefully written words clutched in her hand, though she found she didn't need them. The words were etched in her soul. Silas, she began, her voice clearer, stronger than she had ever imagined it could be. When I first came to this valley, I was a stranger, lost in grief and fear. You offered me shelter, a name, a practical arrangement. You promised me respect, and provision, and safety. You have given me all those things, and so much more. She paused, her gaze sweeping over his face, memorizing the lines of strength and kindness she had come to know so well. You did not promise me kindness, yet you have shown it in 1,000 unspoken ways, in the shelter you built for my fragile plants, in the wood always stacked by the stove, in the way you trust me with your home, your life. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on, the words flowing from a place deep within. You did not promise me patience, yet you have given me space to heal, to find my footing, to grow. You did not promise me understanding, yet in your silences, I have found a deeper comprehension than words could ever convey. The onlookers were utterly still, captivated. Even Jedediah's weathered face showed a flicker of astonishment. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. You asked for a hand in running your house, Ilara continued, a soft smile touching her lips. But you have given me a part of your heart, a place to belong. This land, once so intimidating, now feels like home because you are here. This house, once just a shelter, is now a sanctuary because it holds your presence. She looked directly into his eyes, her own shining with unshed tears, but also with a profound, unwavering love. I came to you with nothing but my sorrows and my solitude. You took my hand, not in passion, but in practicality. But Silas Blackwood, in the quiet spaces of our days, in the rhythm of this shared life, my heart has found its own passion, its own truth. My vow to you today is not one of duty, but of devotion. I give you my deepest respect, my unwavering loyalty, and a love that has taken root in the rich soil of your quiet strength. I am no longer the frightened girl you found on a lonely porch. I am your wife, your partner, your friend. And I will stand by you, through all the seasons of our lives, with all that I am, and all that I have become. When she finished, a profound silence held the meadow, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Then, Silas reached out and took her hands, his grip strong and sure. His eyes, those stormy grey eyes, were luminous. No words were needed. The stunned admiration on the faces of their guests, the tears in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, the almost imperceptible nod of approval from Jedediah, all faded into the background. There was only Silas, his gaze holding hers, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary journey they had undertaken, and the even more extraordinary love that had, against all odds, bloomed in the wilderness. The preacher, visibly moved, pronounced them husband and wife, again. But this time, the words resonated with a depth and truth that had been absent before. As Silas leaned down and, for the first time in front of anyone, gently kissed his wife, a spontaneous cheer went up from their small gathering. It was a simple kiss, chaste yet profoundly intimate, a seal on vows spoken from the heart. The celebration that followed was modest: fresh bread, Ilara's famous apple pie, coffee, and cider. But it was filled with a warmth and genuine joy that surpassed the grandest of feasts. Neighbors who had once viewed Silas with distant respect and Ilara with pity, now saw them as a couple, a true partnership. They saw the quiet strength in Ilara, the subtle softening in Silas. They saw the unspoken understanding that flowed between them, a current of affection as steady and constant as the prairie wind. Mrs. Henderson hugged Ilara tightly. "Oh, child," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would have been so proud. And your mother too." Those were vows to remember. Ilara felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace and fulfillment she had never thought possible. She had spoken her truth, laid bare her heart, and in doing so, had found not vulnerability, but an even deeper strength. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, and their guests began to depart, Silas drew Ilara aside. They stood by the fence, looking out over the land that was their life, their legacy. "Your words," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "They." "Ilara, he struggled, a man unused to expressing the turbulent landscape of his heart. Ilara simply placed her hand on his arm. "I know, Silas," she said softly. "I know." And she did. His silence, his gaze, the way his hand covered hers, they spoke volumes. They were a language she had learned to understand fluently. This journey, begun in desperation and pragmatism, had led them to an unexpected haven. She had arrived a frightened, solitary girl, seeking refuge. She had found not just a husband, but a partner, not just a house, but a home, not just safety, but a profound and abiding love. The world still held its harshness, the land its challenges, but they would face them together, their bond forged in the crucible of shared experience, tempered by respect, and now, openly declared in love. The vast, indifferent sky seemed to hold a new promise. The wind, no longer a mournful dirge, whispered a song of resilience, of hope, of two souls intertwined, their roots running deep into the unforgiving, beautiful earth they called home. Ilara Blackwood, the shy sheriff's daughter, had found her voice, her strength, and her heart in the most unexpected of places, with the most unexpected of men. and in doing so, she had not only stunned a small gathering with her wedding vows, but had also, finally, stunned herself with the depth of her own capacity for love and happiness. Their future stretched before them, as vast and open as the prairie itself, no longer a path to be endured, but a journey to be embraced, together. The quiet rancher and his once timid wife stood side by side, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, two figures silhouetted against the immensity of the coming night, their quiet strength a beacon in the wilderness.